Hi guys, and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Lindsay and today I am back with a solved true crime case. This one was actually unsolved for 34 years. It happened quite a while ago, but I'm quite excited to tell you about this story. It shouldn't be too long of a video, but definitely a case that has been on my mind for a while. So here we are. Today is the story of Diane Maxwell. I am still currently doing research on a much bigger case and it is taking longer than I thought. So I figured I would cover this case in the meantime. And as a heads up, this video will be mentioning sexual assault. If that is a topic you would prefer to avoid, I would highly recommend clicking out. Other than that, remember to like and subscribe if you like this type of content, and let's just get started. Diane Maxwell was born on May 12th, 1944 in Louisiana, and by December 14th, 1969, she was 25 years old and working for Southwestern Bell, which is like a subdivision of like AT&T or something. She was a phone operator. On Sunday, 14th, 1969, she was making her way to work in her red Mustang, and it was a really quiet day. She made it to the car park, parked her car, but somehow never made it inside the building. Shortly after, around 30 minutes after Diane had parked her car, a homeless man by the name of Willie Bell saw a man leave an old shack that was situated next to the parking lot. He got a good look at the man, and once he left, he made his way to the shack just to look inside, and when he opened the door, he found Diane Maxwell on the floor with her hands tied. She had just been sexually assaulted and had been stabbed in the stomach, and she was in a critical condition. Willie ran to a nearby phone booth to call police, but unfortunately, she was pronounced dead on arrival. Her family could not believe what had just happened to her. They were in complete shock, and her father could barely give the news to her siblings. Unfortunately, Diane was also a single mom and she left behind a 4-year-old son. Police immediately searched the shack for any evidence. They found a pink blanket as well as a suit coat, but the shack belonged to an old gas station that was nearby, and they usually use that shack to just store a bunch of random stuff. So a lot of it seemed to be completely unrelated to Diane or potentially related to her attacker. Since there was very little evidence inside the shack, they confronted the homeless man, Willie Bell, in hope that he would be able to give a very accurate description of the man he saw leave the shack. The only description he could give police was that the man was a black male with an afro haircut. That's all he could say. Police knew that whoever had assaulted and killed Diane had stolen her money and her car keys. Her car was no longer there, and they did manage to find it later that night. However, it was left abandoned just a mile away from the scene. The autopsy did confirm that she had been sexually assaulted, and it also showed a single stab wound just above her navel, just above her belly button. And the knife had hit an artery, so police believed that this could have been someone who had some sort of medical knowledge or anatomical knowledge, who would have known where to stab so that it would be a fatal wound. The entire accident seems so brutal and unnecessary. No one could really believe it. Her family was not getting over it, and 20 of her coworkers ended up quitting the job, and they would never leave the house unless they were armed in some capacity. Because there was a prison around 70 miles away from the scene of the crime, police thought that maybe this could have been an inmate who had been recently released and on his way out of prison tried to rob someone to get some cash or get a vehicle to get back on their feet, because obviously they would have left jail without anything. Police did manage to lift prints off of the Mustang that belonged to Diane that had been stolen, and they started comparing them to certain convicts or certain criminals they had in mind. However, everything had to be done manually. This was 1969. They didn't have a database in a computer that they could upload it to. So they focused primarily on inmates who had been recently jailed due to a recent crime. So a crime that would have happened shortly after Diane's murder, because police firmly believed that whoever had attacked her would strike again. This isn't someone who would murder someone as a one-off and then just never commit any other crimes again. They also did try to compare the fingerprints to people who lived in the area. Unfortunately, none of them were a match, and of course, because it had to be done manually, it took a stupid amount of time. So they really had to focus on very likely suspects. What's absolutely heartbreaking about this case is that a couple of weeks prior to Diane's murder, she had spent Thanksgivings with her family. They had no idea this would be the last Thanksgivings they would all spend together. She had pulled her brother David aside to ask him to look after her son should anything ever happen to her. Now, of course he said yes, but no one believed that she actually felt she was in danger or that she felt like she was going to die soon. It was just a bit of a sordid coincidence that she was thinking ahead and she just thought of asking her brother, and a couple of weeks later, unfortunately, her brother had to look after his nephew. The case went cold for 17 years. Police had so little to go on with. They had prints, but it was 1969, and that's about it. They had a vague description of a man. I mean, he just looked like a black man. That's just not enough. And Diane's father was having none of it. He was absolutely devastated to not have answers. They wanted closure. They wanted to know who had done this. They wanted to know why. And he made his son promise that they would solve it before he died. And he was getting old, so the pressure was on, and to the point where David, the son, Diane's brother, decided to rethink his career in law and decided to join the Texas State Highway Patrol so that he could eventually apply to become a Texas Ranger, which is an incredibly elite task force in Texas. It's really, really hard to become a Texas Ranger. At the time, there were only 134. And to this day, I mean, the last time I checked, there was 166. And Texas is huge. So definitely a very prestigious position. And he made it. He managed to make Texas Ranger. And he knew that with that position, he would be able to reopen Diane's case that had gone cold. He had the power. He was in a position where he could look into it again. He was determined to solve it. And he was determined to solve it before his father died. By the time he joined the Texas Rangers, the Houston Police Department had finally invested into the AFIS, which is the Automated Fingerprint Identification System, and that meant that they could compare prints through the computer instead of manually, which would save a lot of time. This was a huge component for the case. They needed this system to stand any chance of matching the fingerprints because they had nothing else to work with. Unfortunately, they uploaded all 15 prints that they found on the steering wheel and on Diane's car. However, none of them were a match. Another 17 years later, so now the case has been unsolved for 34 years. David still hasn't given up. He ends up getting the help of a friend called Jim Ramsey, who was also a homicide investigator, and he finally tells him about Diane's story. He had no idea Diane was David's sister. He had no idea. I'm not sure if he was familiar with the case or not. Either way, he had no idea that David had been keeping this private for so long, especially because he was a good friend of his. He immediately agreed to help his friend, and they started by looking at the evidence that was found the day of the murder. The first thing they wanted to do, Jim wanted to speak to Willie Bell again. They managed to find an address for him in California. However, unfortunately, he had already passed away, so they couldn't speak to him again to see if he could remember any extra details he hadn't shared with police at the time. The good news with the case taking so long to get solved is that time had passed and technology had gotten significantly better, and they were hoping to get DNA from Diane's clothing from the sexual assault and match it to any DNA in the database, because over time inmates were forced to provide a DNA sample when going to jail. So upon entry in prison, I think they would just give a sample of DNA and it would go into a database. So now they would have a larger pool to search from, and they were hoping that they no longer just needed to rely on fingerprints. They now had the DNA from the clothing. However, when they made their way to the evidence room, they realized that someone had gotten rid of Diane's clothing. They gotten rid of the evidence bag probably because they had to make more room for newer evidence. This was 34 years old, so unfortunately someone had gotten rid of it. So they had no DNA to compare to. To make things worse, all of the pictures taken at the crime scene that were used as evidence, as well as the negatives, had been sold to a British magazine called Master Detective. Someone in 1971 took the pictures from the crime scene and took the negatives and sold them to a magazine, which is incredibly illegal. And I don't know how they never found out about this, but unfortunately that meant that they had absolutely zero pictures, zero negatives, nothing to work with. They were honestly just hitting walls. Like everywhere they looked, it was just a dead end. It was just the worst news ever. They tried to contact the magazine, and of course they no longer had the pictures or the negatives. Hey, you done? All they did have was one last copy of the magazine, probably in their archives, probably as just a sample. And they didn't even want to send it to them. They were afraid they were gonna like lose it or damage it, so they didn't want to send the last copy of the magazine to solve a case, which is just so infuriating. But anyway, Jim ended up asking the guy to make photocopies of the pictures in the magazine, which ended up kind of being useless. I mean, it was just a terrible black and white photocopy of the pictures, and they really didn't end up providing much information, but it was just such a blow to the investigation to not be able to have the DNA samples from the clothing or the pictures or the negatives from the pictures. And you're thinking, wow, they're really, like, they can't catch a break. And it gets so much worse. They can't find the fingerprints that had been taken from Diane's steering wheel after the car was stolen. They knew the fingerprints were somewhere, but they had been misplaced or misfiled, and they had thousands and thousands of files to sift through in order to find the fingerprints. And Diane's dad, or David's dad, was getting older. He was in his 90s by then, and David was devastated. He thought, there's no way I'm going to solve this in time. Every time we try to look at something bad happens. Like, it looks like it's never going to get solved. After a long time sifting through all of these files, they finally managed to find them in the 1984 files instead of the 1969. They had been completely misfiled, but they were still there. Someone had found them, and they could finally put the fingerprints through APHIS again. Again, they had a lot of downsides on this case, but I think one of the major upside was time was on their side, because over time the database had gotten larger and technology had gotten better. So now they had the technology to upload the prints and search through the entire Texas database, which is huge. Unfortunately, there wasn't a match, but they ended up looking through the FBI national database, and they had 20 hits. And they were looking very promising. Jill Kincaid searched or looked at all 20 hits manually to compare them to the prints on Diane's car, and it came with one true match. They were finally catching a break. The fingerprint belonged to James Davis, a 58-year-old man who had spent his entire life being a criminal. He had been out of jail for 9 years, I believe, 9 or 10 years, but he had committed multiple crimes throughout his life. He had been in jail for assault, robbery, car theft, and he had also abducted a young girl. Jim Ramsey made his way to his home, which was a federally funded building, probably because after jail he couldn't get a place of his own. And he made his way to James's house, introduced himself, and showed him a picture of Diane's car. However, he tried to look away. He wasn't interested. He said he'd never seen that car before, which, again, very stupid to say. It's a red Mustang. I'm sure you've seen a red Mustang at one point in your life. And then he followed up by showing him a picture of Diane Maxwell and says, "Do you recognize her?" And he just, again, looked away, didn't want to take the picture. Jim was trying to give it to him, didn't want to take the picture, just looked away, kept denying his involvement, until finally Jim told him that they had fingerprints that matched the ones found in the car, and he finally confessed to the murder. And police were right. He had actually gotten out of jail, 9 days before Diane's attack and murder. He had just gotten out of the jail that was 70 miles away. He was looking for money, he was looking for a ride, and he decided to... Oh, you can see her. He decided... Sorry. I get distracted very easily, but you can see her in the background. She's digging a tunnel. So he decided to hold her at knife point and made his way to the shack where he robbed her I don't know what order he did this in, but he sexually assaulted her, stabbed her, and walked away. This man had the actual audacity to hope that the judge would be kind to him because he had already spent so much time in jail throughout his life, as if that makes a difference. But I think it's because he had technically spent the last 9 to 10 years not causing any trouble. He felt like he had learned his lesson. He was no longer a criminal. So he thought that was enough. However, that doesn't change the past, and the judge was having none of it. On January 15th, 2004, 34 years and 1 month after Diane's murder, James Davis got sentenced to life in jail for murder with malice. He absolutely didn't really show much emotion or any remorse. He only seemed upset that he would have to go back to jail. He genuinely thought he had spent enough time in jail, and that was how jail worked. And it's just awful that it came to that. He wanted some money and a lift or a car. He didn't need to sexually assault her. He absolutely did not need to murder her. It seems like such a brutal crime for very little in return. He didn't even keep the car. Like, it's just, I mean, I'm not saying it would have been more worth it if he had, obviously. I'm just saying, like, it just seems like very, very, very unnecessary and very brutal for what he got out of it, which makes me think he definitely should be spending the rest of his life in jail. It's frustrating that it took so long to solve because, of course, it would have prevented James Davis from committing more crimes. In the meantime, he would have gone to jail much earlier, much sooner in life. He probably would have gotten a life sentence as well. However, I'm genuinely just relieved to know that Diane's father was alive long enough to find out what happened and who had done it, and that David had just changed his entire career around to solve his sister's murder. Like, you don't hear that every day. I think that takes a huge, amount of dedication and love and patience to power through, especially when there were so many blows to this investigation. I mean, it had gone cold. He changed his job so he could reopen the case. And every time they hit a dead end, they just kept pushing. And luckily, time was on their side because the technology improved and the database widened, and they managed to find a hit. They managed to get the guy. And yeah, it's a bit of a short story, but I kind of like those stories where you see someone try so hard and they solve it, because it could easily have gone cold and just never been solved. It only got solved because David decided to become a Texas Ranger. How wild is that? So everything makes a difference. Anything can make a difference. And I think, yeah, it's a huge proof of love. And I'm glad that Diane's parents managed to find out what happened. They passed away, I believe, from what I could find online. Her mother passed away in 2007 and her father in 2010. So actually had a really, really long life. But again, you hear these stories where someone wants to solve a case before they die, and sometimes they do, which is really sad. So that's it for today's case, guys. Do you like my new necklace? I made it today, and I'm so excited. This is everything 13-year-old me would have wanted. I'm very happy. But yeah, that's it for today's video, guys. Hopefully the next video is the case I've been working on for so long. Might be a two-parter. Very excited to share that with you. If you've liked this video, please like and subscribe. And if you have any suggestions for any other cases you'd like to see me cover, please comment down below, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.